Hello, everybody. I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. And so today I picked one of those books that I sometimes wind up reading because it was on the shelf and was just kind of in existence, and I thought, why not? Apparently, this was a book that wound up on our shelf because Mom was at a book sale and said, why not? So Chaucer and the French Tradition is shockingly a book of some actual intellectual discourse. Yes, I'm surprised as you are. And basically, the idea behind this book is that the author, Charles Muscatine, back in 1957, 1966, 57, yeah, copyright date is 57, the fifth printing is 66. Anyways, so he posited that Chaucer is less a creature of English tradition, despite the fact that he was in fact working in, well, Middle English, to use the technical terminology, but was in fact a creature of the French tradition, and that the shape and style of his poetry derives very specifically out of the courtly romantic poetry tradition and the so-called bourgeois or realistic. And that what you have in Chaucer is somebody who has taken these two lines of poetry, styles of poetry, and is sort of mixing and matching and combining them together because these two styles of poetry are sharply contrasting in some ways and have a couple of essential similarities that, honestly, when you look at them, I suspect really derives from a very medieval perspective on the world, because there is a lot, not entirely, but there's a lot in the medieval perspective that is something that we in the present era would consider to be wholly artificial, but was seen as sort of just how things are. So the courtly tradition of poetry, as described in this book, you're dealing with, le roman de rose. You're dealing with a lot of those early French, a lot of earlier French medieval poetry, and what you have happening in romantic poetry of that period is that it's not meant to be realistic. It's like a Disney movie. When you're watching the Sleeping Beauty from back in the day, and the prince shows up, and he and Aurora fall in love in 38 seconds flat, and she gets over the fact that this strange man just came lunging out of the woods at her, and all this stuff, and they fall in love basically immediately. You have to see that it is a function of how these Disney fairy tales work, that love at first sight is very much a thing. It's how that world functions. That there are simply people who run into each other and they immediately just know right off the bat that they are meant to be together forever and ever and ever. And that's just how that works. And there's a lot in these courtly love poems that has to do with that. The notion in courtly love that the knight is supposed to devote himself to his lady fair, who is frequently married, and is supposed to come to her in all humbleness. He is supposed to, not push or anything else, and would give all for a mere kiss of her cool white hand, or whatever it may be. And it's an incredibly artificial, chivalric form. The shape of it, there's a lot of Arthuriana that is mixed up in that. There's a lot of hyper dramatic stuff. There's a lot of swooning and fainting and staggering around, and as described in this book, that swooning and fainting is a lot like a Broadway musical. You know, when you have a Broadway musical and you're watching Singin' in the Rain, you are not to assume that this is happening in a real world place where people actually burst into song. What the song and dance is it is taking the place of what in a stage play would have been a lengthy soliloquy on the nature of how much this person is in love with somebody else. That instead of Gene Kelly standing there and declaiming for 3.5 minutes about how amazingly wonderful this woman he's in love with is, instead he sings a song and dances wildly in the street with what was apparently a 102-degree fever, goodness help us all. So, the thing is that these romances, they are very highfalutin, they're very artificial, and they're very high art. There's a great deal of this that comes out of the higher education and the artificiality and the sort of thing that you only get when you have people who have the kind of free time that the very wealthy have, or, you know, the free time that the people who are sponsored by the very wealthy have, to come up with these incredibly artificial ways of viewing the world, of seeing the world, of describing things, of saying, you know, she swooned 18 times in a row. Well, no, if this were remotely realistic, she wouldn't, but we're trying some literary hyperbole to describe the grand romance of the moment. As compared to this, the bourgeois or so-called realistic stuff is, in a lot of ways, it's middle-brow to low-brow in style and topic, and this comes out of the fact that what you have is the rise of the middle classes, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the rise of people who were previously poor and suddenly have the money to afford to pay somebody to get them entertainments, to write them poetry. And the thing is that they don't want to hear this weird stuff about women who faint every 3 seconds because some man has thrown a rose at them. They want stories that are recognizable to them. And so these are very sitcom-y in a lot of ways. The thing about them is that there is a similar artificiality, there is an artificiality that is similar in nature but not in content, one might say. It's like a sitcom. Sitcoms have certain tropes, certain requirements, certain things that they do, but you don't consider them as a general rule. There are, of course, always exceptions in every genre, but fundamentally one is not to consider the sitcom fundamentally to be high art. You are to look at that and say, this is something that it has a series of tropes. We know where things go, and even though we don't have laugh tracks in sitcoms anymore, we know where the laugh tracks would be. We know where the jokes are supposed to be. We know where we're supposed to laugh. We know the rhythm of the jokes that are supposed to be in these things. And as he points out, they don't tend to have a lot of... They tend to be very realistic, very earthy, in that you're dealing with people who are in situations that are recognizable. They are not taking place in some airy-fairy noble garden where magic and knights and hyper-dramatic stuff. It's taking place in, you know, a realistic village. One of the things he points out, actually, is that in the description in those bourgeois poems, that if an object is described, that means that that object will be used. If somebody says that there is a bucket under the window, somebody will be getting their foot stuck in that bucket. So he has this build-up in which he discusses these two forms of these two types of poetry and the forms that they take, and then he goes on to discuss Chaucer and what Chaucer is doing in the various poems that he's written, obviously culminating with the Canterbury Tales, is he is combining the tropes and styles of these two. He's not discussing rhythm or meter. He's not discussing form in that formalist way that we're all used to, where you say this line is this many feet long and has this rhythm, and the break in the rhythm will symbolize this, that, or the other thing. He is instead discussing how characters are described, whether that description of a character is romantic or realistic, whether the dialogue between two characters is romantic or realistic. Is it a lot of wild speechifying on the nature of truth and love and what have you, or is it somebody having an actual conversation? And how he takes the tropes, these sets of artificial tropes, and combines the two of them to play off each other, to play off and point out the holes and fallacies that exist in the romantic stuff, but also the ones that exist in the so-called realistic stuff, because the realistic or bourgeois stuff isn't realistic any more than most sitcoms are realistic. You know, you don't actually get realism in a sitcom because it's television and there are things that you have to reduce or take out or control for because it's fiction, and because of how a sitcom is supposed to work. And so he's playing up on these two things and playing them off each other. And in the end, his point in this book sort of culminates in the statement that Chaucer is the last medieval whose world is wide yet still intelligible, viable, and one. Because it's almost as though he's written this book in protest to people who seem to see Chaucer as a forerunner of the Renaissance rather than a tail end of the medieval period. Because the Renaissance is something that kicks in, yes, right after the medieval period, where you have sort of the rise of classical stuff, of Greek and Roman literature, the rediscovery of lost classics, the rediscovery of all of these things that are in fact precursors to the literature and philosophy and whatnot of the medieval period. These things that got lost somewhere around the year 300 to 600 and didn't surface again until about 1500, give or take, obviously. And the thing is that up until a certain point, that you have the rise of humanism, which is the rise of the concept of man is the measure of all things, the rise of the concept of writing about things as they are right in front of us. It's the rise of, for example, using perspective in Western art. And this is a very, very Western thing, so obviously I'm not even going to be discussing anything that is happening outside of Europe because that has no place in this discussion. The point is, that's when you start to get perspective, when you start having people say, I am not going to draw this where Christ is the biggest thing because Christ is the most important thing. I'm going to have to make Christ big and central, and everything else has to be further away, off to the side, a little bit down the hallway, in order to make it smaller if I'm going to create that emphasis. And if Christ is in fact physically farther away, then I'm going to have to make Christ physically smaller on my canvas, and so on and so forth. It's about, and my focus in university was art history, so that's what I know. I didn't do literature. The point is, though, that you have a similar reflection in literature of a shift towards realism as we think of it now, as in, this is how people are actually in real life. If somebody swoons, they're going to have a reason for it, and they're certainly not going to walk 5 steps swooning every 2. And so that there's sort of a confusion that this author feels because Chaucer has so much very realistic dialogue, has so much interplay between these two styles that he feels like it almost tricks one into seeing it as Renaissance style, as humanist style, but it is in point of fact a synthesis of medieval thinking instead. And that's my summary, and if you want to know more about the book, I would advise you to actually dig it up if you can find a copy and read it yourself. That's all, and I will see you all next week.